You probably think the badge around your neck as a convenience. An access card that opens doors, that pays for lunches, that lets someone in the break room. Mine was not that. Mine was a dead man's switch dressed like jewelry, a small titanium token on a blue lanyard that, if severed, would make the building forget how to read the language we use to keep secrets. It was subtle, and that was part of its power. Nobody who didn't understand the design would know it mattered. That is why when a man with more charisma than sense decided to cut it in front of a room full of colleagues, the consequences didn't arrive as a punch. They arrived as a collapse. A structure that had been quietly supporting 5 years of classified work simply stopped holding. I should start by explaining who I was in that building and what holding meant. For 15 years, I designed systems intended to be boring. You don't get hired to protect classified programs by offering theatrical solutions. You get hired by being boring, and crucially, by being right over and over. My formal title at Ashford Dynamics, Chief Security Architect, covered a lot of hours in server rooms, nights with tape crates, and an embarrassment of memos stamped and notarized. It also covered the rituals. Every morning I would walk down 3 flights beneath the lobby, past the security desk where Marcus, who had been a fixture since before the company started selling enterprise middleware, kept a coffee cup that looked like it had a permanent ring on the cork. The air smelled faintly of ozone and coffee every morning. The servers hummed like a cathedral choir. Efficiency in those rooms was a kind of liturgy. On my lanyard hung a small titanium token. To the casual observer, it was a bit heavy, a little inconvenient, but acceptable because it got you into labs and conference rooms. The people who were cleared to handle it treated it like an instrument. It had weight the way a scalpel does, the sense that you could do something precise with it, or irreversibly wrong. For our purposes, we use the term hardware tether in formal documents. In memos, I sometimes called it the Rosetta Stone for the data. Remove the stone, you don't translate the tablets anymore. We worked under contracts that required certain physical safeguards to be in place. Those were not bureaucratic preferences. They were requirements that came wrapped in audit criteria and penalties. That entire regulatory scaffolding, DCSA reviews, periodic NSA audits, the peculiar choreography of clearing paperwork, assumed friction. It assumed that accessing some of what we stored would take a sequence of physical and bureaucratic steps, multiple custodians, and a chain of custody that would be auditable down to the timestamp. The cloud was a marketing phrase. The reality was an ecosystem of controls and failsafes that had been iterated on because people had been careless before. My job was to respect the friction when the market promised ease.
For the first decade at Ashford, the friction worked. We won contracts, we passed audits, and we were quiet about the nuts and bolts because most of our clients preferred their architects uncelebrated. I liked the anonymity. You can only be right so many times before being called conservative. I had learned that the work itself would have the final say. It is a peculiar kind of humility to spend your life making impossible systems reliable, to prefer the sound of a backup tape being properly labeled to the applause of a product launch. That humility produced trust, a slow accretion of trust that showed up in procurement calendars and funding renewals. It also filled my desk with paper. When I say paper, I do not mean the performative memo someone throws into Slack. I mean paper with seals and notaries. I mean memos that you sign, hand over, and watch enter a physical file. The day I first typed the memo that would later be evidence of my resistance to a change, I printed 3 copies on legal paper, ran them through a company notary, and placed them in 3 places. One on Miriam Cole's desk with a copy slid under the glass nameplate of the general counsel's office, one in the fireproof safe in the sub-basement, the one guarded by Marcus and accessible only by a combination kept in a sealed envelope, and one in my briefcase in an envelope stamped with the date. That was not paranoia, that was procedure. You can read those memos as relics of an older era, and to some people they looked that way. They smelled of ink and legal advice, and for a long time they seemed quaint, the last gasp of a generation that believed a signature meant something. Then the company hired Kieran Ashford. Kieran arrived with everything that tends to unsettle a security program: youth, capital language confidence, and a narrative that management absolutely loves to hear. "We're stuck in the past," he said at his first town hall. "Friction is a feature for the kind of companies that don't scale." He had been appointed Vice President of Digital Innovation, a title that sounds like possibility and often functions as a legal disclaimer. He was also the CEO's son. Lawrence Ashford means a lot of things to a lot of people. In some rooms, his name still carried a round, reassuring cadence, the sort that closes meetings. To Kieran, his father's reputation was both inheritance and obstacle. Project Velocity, his flagship, was a slide deck of kinetic fonts and stock imagery, smiling faces, open palms, and exaggerated arrows shooting up. The promise was simple and tempting: faster authentication, frictionless experience, democratized access. He proposed to retire the lanyard, as if the lanyard were an antique, a bad habit. He proposed facial recognition on employee devices, a centralized identity system hosted on modern infrastructure, a single pane of glass where access was a matter of convenience. He could explain it in terms that made executives nod: cost savings, ease of onboarding, the optics of modernity. The rhetoric was not inherently dangerous. The danger lay in the speed.
the disregard for existing requirements, and the social physics of the company itself. When a man with a mandate calls something stuck and promises to liberate it, people who are paid to move needles begin to move. My team saw the pitch deck, and I saw the slant, the line items labeled Decommission Hardware Tether and Pilot Facial ID. I saw the bullet points that implied bypassing standards without the shamelessness of explicit words. I have a way of reading policy in between the slides. I recognized the pattern. I had seen it before. The disruptive metaphor, followed by a push to collapse friction, followed by a flurry of administrative edits that would, if left unchecked, erase safeguards. So I did what I thought was prudent. I scheduled a meeting with Karen. I copied Miriam. I sent a calendar invite to Jared Frey, who at the time was the acting head of IT, and whose job description, in practice, was to make whatever the executive office wanted feel technically possible as quickly as possible. The meeting took place in a glass conference room on the 20th floor, the kind of room designed to give people the feeling that they were participating in decisive governance. Kieran was young, smiling, sleeves rolled, and he had slid a prototype phone across the table showing, of all things, an app that made employee photos look like glossy magazine headshots. "Watch," he said. "Scan your face and you're in. No lanyard, no fuss, no that old token holding us back." He looked at me as if I might smile back. I looked at him and thought of the memos in my briefcase. I thought of audits. I thought of the class of work we did and the people who depended on those protections. I told him calmly that this particular approach could not be rushed, and that we were bound by contractually mandated hardware requirements. I explained that some of our clients require a physical component to authentication, and that the presence of that physical component was not a theatrical relic but a stipulation. I did not use the words dead man switch in that meeting. I also did not leave the meeting without sending an immediate follow-up email documenting the points I had raised, with the phrase "for the record" somewhere near the subject line. That phrase, "for the record," appeared later in the files as an important anchor. It is a phrase that makes people listen because it announces that your words are not ephemeral. The follow-up note went to the executive suite, to Miriam, and to Jared. Shortly afterwards, I placed a notarized copy as procedure dictates. There was a pattern emerging. As Kieran advocated for acceleration, I documented my opposition. The company, like many, kept both momentum and caution in its bloodstream. Momentum wants applause, caution leaves breadcrumbs.
At first, Kieran's moves were performative. He pushed presentations, he organized demonstrations in auditorium-style events, he framed the lanyard as a symbol of past caution. He joked about how legacy security slowed onboarding. He hovered in hallways and said things to junior staff about how much faster we'd be if we didn't have to hold on to little trinkets. He courted the press. He courted internal champions by promising promotions and new team budgets. He liked slides with big numbers. Jared, who had been in his role for less than 2 years but knew how to read an executive mood, became an accelerant. Jared was efficient when efficiency was rewarded. He was malleable when malleability served his path. He started to show up at our operations center with requests, some formal, some not, for changes that supported the pilot. Alarms on dashboards flickered when those requests came in. I watched the meter of minor infractions climb. An API permission moved to allow a test, an alert channel rerouted for a convenience. None of these things in isolation would have toppled a system. Systems fail when causal threads are cut in sequence, and no one notices the pattern until the structure lists. I began to keep a log. I am fond of logs. They are how histories stay honest. The log was a simple file: date, time, action, and my notes. I dated entries with precision because, in my experience, exactness makes a claim harder to deny. 0316, 0912. Town Hall. Project velocity announced publicly. Slide deck labeled Decommission Lanyard Pilot, among subpoints. Audience applause. Noted PR emphasis on frictionless. 0318, 1403. Meeting with VP Digital Innovation and Acting Head IT. Expressed contractual constraints related to hardware tether. Follow-up email sent for the record. Miriam CC'd. 0320, 1147. Jared requested admin change to permit test authentications via prototype API. Request marked pilot but lacked formal change control. Alert, elevated risk flag on operations dashboard, investigate. Each entry was a breadcrumb. I also printed certain pieces and sent them in sealed envelopes to Miriam. I wanted a paper trail that would not evaporate if someone decided that the digital log could be sanitized later. That is one of the practical lessons of working with secured information. Paper survives Sermonstern's incident. It is less charming than the cloud, but far more persistent. As the pilot moved from slides to demonstrations, the cultural tone of the company shifted subtly. Employees want to feel modern. The promise of facial ID made it feel like work would be easier. There is a real human cost to friction. If an internal process wastes someone's time every day, morale erodes. Kieran knew this and framed his initiative as humane. That framing made dissent harder to sell. Who wants to argue against easing someone's day? I am not insensitive to the need for better experiences. Some processes were genuinely dated.
My concern was that the architecture of the change was being shaped by optics rather than by risk assessment. A risk assessment is not a roadblock, it is a map. You consult it to know where bridges have been removed and what the detours look like. Kieran treated the assessment as a suggestion. When I began to see administrative requests escalate into changes with fewer approvals, I grew more careful. Not because I wanted to obstruct, because mistakes in our domain are not just technical failures. They are failures that cascade into loss of access, regulatory infractions, and the kind of headaches that do not have a neat PR fix. I started to talk to people outside the company, quietly, to get a sense of whether we were trending toward a problem. Those conversations were professional and discreet. No sensational emails, no leaked memos, just the kind of prudence that shows up as a phone call asking if a test was properly consented. Some people in the company read my caution as conservatism and my documentation as obstruction. There is a common story in corporate life where a person who protects a system is framed as a block to innovation. For a brief period, I experienced both sides of that narrative. Internally, a few young engineers would drop comments in the console. "Are we still doing this analog lanyard thing?" They meant it as a joke. I did not find it funny. I found it human. Then there were the escalations that made it clear this was not just about culture. One Friday afternoon in April, as I was preparing to leave, I noticed an unusual pattern of requests tied to accounts associated with the executive suite. Not just testing logs, but configuration requests coming from an admin account provisioned to the executive office. The system flagged them because the requests touched custodial parameters. I pulled up the log and saw IP addresses that mapped to devices in the CEO's reserved network space. To the system, it looked like someone in the executive suite was trying to make sweeping policy shifts. To me, it looked like a problem. I called Miriam. Her presence in the organization had been a stabilizing force. She is the kind of counsel who reads the statute books like poetry. Her reaction when I explained the flagged activity was the sort of thing lawyers do. Concise, measured, efficient. "Document everything," she said. "Seal copies. Don't take unilateral action that could be construed as obstruction, but do preserve the trail." I secured the memos. I wrote another entry in my log, and then I printed a copy and slid it into the envelope in my briefcase. It is easy to make narrative choices that make the dissent heroically dramatic. That was not my mood. My mood was procedural. I am fond of an internal phrase: competence is quiet. It is the opposite of theatrical. Competence keeps a timestamp and a photocopy. Competence writes memos and puts them in safes. Competence does not thrive on applause.
It thrives on the small human acts of discipline that, in aggregate, keep an apparatus functioning. Those small acts began to become visible in the way the executive office operated. Jared started to appear less in the operations center and more at the executive desk. Meetings that once required formal minutes began to be coordinated by quick Slack threads and quick approvals. The dashboard's risk flags flickered. I began to notice in meetings a softness around language: temporary exception, pilot scope, for a limited demonstration. Those are terms that mean much less in the architecture of compliance than they sound. A temporary exception made in public can become permanent if not properly framed. I tried to build bridges. I tried to translate security requirements into the language of convenience. I said, we can explore modern authentication models in parallel, but we must maintain the hardware tether for production until contractual and audit criteria are satisfied. A pilot is not a decommission. I explained that our clients expected a tactile control for certain classes of data, that this was not a matter of preference but of obligation. I did so calmly. I also recommended staged approaches, incremental pilots in non-production environments that would not disturb custodian control. Those recommendations were not accepted with enthusiasm. As the summer approached, the tone in executive briefings hardened. Lawrence, my direct contact with the board and the CEO, did not always involve himself in the tactical details, but he did know the optics he wanted for the company. He wanted Ashford Dynamics to look sleek, to attract new markets, to shed the image of contracting for defense and move into more commercial, higher-margin work. He also wanted his son to have a platform. That is a normal human dynamic in family-led businesses. It becomes problematic when the platform's theatrics risk the integrity of controlled programs. There was one crucial moment that, in hindsight, should have been the line someone refused to cross. Kieran proposed a public ceremony, a town hall where the company would symbolically retire the hardware token. The stage would be set with a glass box containing a handful of the lanyards. He described a moment where leadership would demonstrate their confidence in a new system by physically severing the lanyard in front of employees. A ceremonial cut, he called it. The phrasing was crucial. Ceremony implies symbolism, and symbolism implies permanence to those who misunderstand it. I should have objected more forcefully. I did object. I went to Miriam and to Lawrence. I told them that using a ritualized act to mark a policy change without properly completing the technical validation and contractual sign-offs would be irresponsible. Miriam, who had copies of my notarized memos, told me that she had warned the board in private counsel. Lawrence listened, and then he listened again to his son.
He was caught, as many leaders are.
between the desire to keep a family narrative intact and the legal obligations of running a public-facing firm. A memo from Miriam found its way into my notebook. She wrote, in her manner, direct and unflinching, that any public symbol implying the removal of hardware tethering should be explicitly framed as symbolic and not operative, and that any physical act should be ceremonial only, with no operational effect. She advised that if the ceremony were to proceed, the device used, the lanyards in the box, must be inert, disconnected from production systems, and clearly documented as demonstration equipment. Her advice was sound. It was ignored. The morning of the announced town hall, the building felt like an orchestra tuning, voices under an awareness of performance, the metallic scent of coffee, the glint of mobile phones. I walked down the hall to the auditorium, carrying my token in my pocket. I left my briefcase upstairs in my office. On the way, I passed people who wanted to be seen at the event, marketing staff with small cameras, young engineers with speculative pride, the compliance team in neutral colors. There was a buzz from the stage. Someone had arranged flowers, chairs were set, and the slide behind the podium read Project Velocity, the future is frictionless, in a font that attempted to be retrofuturistic. Kieran moved like a man who had practiced speeches before mirrors. He smiled at the crowd and tossed a line about liberating talent from slow processes that generated a ripple of applause. He was very good at making people feel that what he proposed was both inevitable and humane. I sat near the front because I wanted to be present. I also wanted to be visible, a quiet counterweight. I had no illusions that my presence would perform any bureaucratic miracle, but I wanted the moment to be recorded. My decision to be present would be one more point in the chain of custody for the truth of what had transpired. People remember presence. They remember who stood where when a thing occurred. During his remarks, Kieran made a point of calling attention to the lanyard in the glass case, the same one he had used in briefings. He described its obsolescence with a kind of theatrical melancholy. He then announced with the sort of flourish that lives on marketing calendars that he would retire the lanyard now, to applause. He called up a set of ceremonial scissors that reflected the stage lights. There was a chuckle from the audience. Someone took out a phone. I felt, in that instant, a peculiar coolness under the skin. I should describe the moment because moments matter. The scissors had an absurd weight to their symbolism, bright metal produced to look like history. The lanyard sat in its glass box, pristine and cheery, like an exhibit in a museum of obsolete objects. Around us, people shifted and smiled at the spectacle.
It was a human gesture that made everyone present feel like an insider in a company reinvention narrative. And then something else happened. A hush snuck into the room, as if someone had slid a window to cut the sound of the city. I saw Miriam stand a little to the side, jaw tight but still in the audience, because her presence would be documentation. I saw Jared, who had by then taken on the role of public ally, clapping at the front with a smile that was trying to keep up. I felt the titanium of the token in my pocket like a small gravity. I had expected the ceremonial act to be symbolic and inert. I had expected the lanyard to be demonstrative only, separated from production systems by procedures and visible disclaimers. It is important to repeat that expectation, because when people ask me about that day, they ask whether there was a way to know that anything real would follow. The design of that morning was meant to be a gesture, a physical object being ceremonially retired, without touching the mechanisms that governed access. If I am honest, there was also a private dread. I had watched certain administrative pathways change. I had seen alerts flicker and requests come from devices in the executive suite. My memos were notarized but not immune to being misread. I thought, this could be theatrical or it could be dangerous, but until the moment the scissors cut anything, it was still possible, legally and technically, to denote it as symbolic and harmless. And then I stepped into the light at center stage. The room seemed to condense around that movement. Kieran held the scissors forward like a conductor's baton. His smile was both triumph and a plea for applause. People leaned in. A camera angle caught the glint of the scissors, the sheen of the token, and the briefcase of sound that his applause paused. I did not speak. I had already said what I needed to say in memos, in council, in small conversations. My presence at the stage and the sound of the token in my pocket were my final quiet protest. If anything was to be done publicly, one should at least stand with the thing one defends. A short line of people whispered, some because they wanted to film it for posterity, some because they wanted to be part of the moment. Miriam drifted closer to the aisle. Jared smiled. The microphone hissed. The lights made sudden islands of warmth on the people in the first few rows. The guard, Marcus, who never left his post unless summoned, and who had a way of watching a room that made you uncomfortable if you were doing something you shouldn't, stood with his hands lightly clasped. There were all told 4 dozen witnesses. Kieran lifted the scissors. That is where the rhythm of this story changes. It is the sliver of time between the lift and the descent that makes narrative. In that fraction, I could feel my heartbeat arrange itself like a clock taking stock. The titanium in my pocket warmed against me.
My thumb found the split in the lanyard leather. For a breath, the room held as if we had been asked to inhale at once. And then he moved. He was brisk. He sliced the lanyard like a ribbon. The motion was simple, ceremonious, visually perfect. It was the kind of image that would make a press montage. People cheered, phones recorded, the scissors clinked. What I felt then was both immediate and counterintuitive. It was not a dramatic, cinematic explosion. There was no visible flame, no smoke. There was a sense of a hinge opening elsewhere, a mechanical sigh. Somewhere in the building, a set of processes that no one on the stage could see began to interpret the physical act as an operational event. The system, built by people who prefer invisibility and keep their work in quiet logs, began to follow a protocol. I did what I always do in moments of consequence. I took out my phone and checked the dashboard. You learn, after years of work with complex systems, to look at the small icons and to understand a change in them like a physician reading a pulse. The dashboard did not look like fireworks. It looked like a shift, a set of indicators in amber where before there had been green. There were messages that any one of them by itself might not have meant much, an automated alert, an email from the monitoring service. But together they arranged themselves into a pattern that meant a custodial event had just been recognized by the system. My hand was steady because my training had taught me that in the face of a failure, panic is a service to nobody. I logged the time. My watch read 10:17 a.m. The auditorium light seemed suddenly dimmer. People were still clapping, some with faces that had not yet seen the meaning of the thing they had witnessed. Miriam's eyes found me, and in them there was a calculation being made. Legal, reputational, procedural. Jared Smanel had vanished into a look I had not seen on him before, uncertainty trying to pass for composure. The CEO, Lawrence, sat in the front row with his hands slightly clenched. I thought of the memos in my briefcase. I thought of the notarized copies sitting in different places. I thought of the way system designs interpret physical reality when someone in a room makes a gesture. That moment, abrupt, ceremonial, witnessed, was the hinge I have been circling since the memos. It is the fulcrum on which the rest of the story will balance. At the time, in that room, it felt like a cut that had been made public for the sake of a narrative. It did not yet feel like the beginning of a collapse. The collapse would be quieter, and then later, impossibly loud. But for now, the scissors had been used. The audience still clapped. The slide behind Kieran updated to a triumphant graphic. My phone sat in my hand with an amber alert pulsing on its screen. I had 1,000 small options in front of me, 1,000 little acts I could perform in the next 10 minutes.
I could speak, I could move, I could call counsel, I could walk out. I chose, out of a mixture of profession and principle, to remain where I was, to document and to let the record be clear that I had been present when the lanyard was cut. I also took one more instinctive step. I found Miriam, handed her my printed log entry, and said, simply, I recorded the time. She nodded. Her fingers brushed the paper as if bestowing a seal. If you are watching this and wondering what you would do in that moment, that is reasonable. People imagine dramatic confrontations, shouted denouncements, or arrests. Corporate life is rarely cinematic in that way. Instead, it is procedural, legalistic, and full of small acts that either build a case or fail to. My actions were small because small things are often how truth is protected. After the applause, Kieran took a bow. People began to discuss refreshments. Marketing wanted duplicates of the photos. Someone asked for a quote for the press release. The auditorium slowly became a reception. And beneath the surface of the applause, the system I helped design had interpreted a physical interruption as a custodial capture event. I am stopping this segment of the narration here, because in that pause between the applause and the phone calls that began to arrive, the choices, by design and by accident, that would define what happened next had not yet been executed. The cut had been made, but the fallout was still arranging itself. There were memos to draft, calls to make, and a boardroom that would convene with different information than it had that morning. There was also, hidden in the days to come, a list of external actors, federal agencies, auditors, counsel, that would register the event from angles outside our control. If you want to understand what it feels like when the architecture you built is suddenly treated as theater, picture an old stone bridge gusting with wind that you can see is shaking. The bridge does not collapse immediately. It shudders. People on it become aware. The engineers arrive. The questions multiply. That is where we were. A shudder under applause. The first hint of structural response, invisible to the audience, but very present to those who knew how to read the instruments. Before any of the formal fallout began, before the calls to compliance, before the auditors sketched the outline of an inquiry,
There were faces and paper and a sound that is easy to overlook, the clicking of cameras. History, in our modern age, is made both of human action and of media. The cut had been filmed. The cut had been signed into the record by witnesses. My memos were in multiple places. Miriam had been present. Those facts, small and sterile, would matter tremendously later. I looked at Kieran once more. He was smiling, pleased with his moment. He had done something that many people mistake for leadership. He had created a story. Leadership is sometimes a storyteller's trade.
The problem is when story supplants structure. I had spent 15 years building that structure. He had spent weeks polishing a story. The early CTA here is simple and human. Tell me where you're watching from in the comments. The geography of eyes matters in a story like this, because the consequences of decisions like the cut are not only local, they are felt across regions, programs, and teams who rely on the quiet work of keeping systems intact. I want to know if someone watching this remembers a similar moment, a time when performance tried to outrun prudence, and where you lived when it happened. I will pause the narrative now at the moment after the cut, with the applause thinning and the first alerts beginning to glow on my phone. The next sequence involves badged entries, regulatory notices, and the quiet desperation of people who realize that a policy change has been interpreted as an operational event without the safeguards in place to handle it. There will be calls that I did not expect, boardroom exchanges where legal positions are negotiated, and the slow, grinding work of trying to preserve data that some systems had begun to treat as irretrievable. Right now, in the light after the ceremony, the room smelled of coffee and floral arrangements, and the faint metallic tang of adrenaline. People were swapping photos. The slide behind the stage looped the company's new slogan. On my phone, the amber alert sat like a warning light you decide whether to chase. I folded my hands, made another log entry, and felt the old steady certainty that if you did not keep careful records, the world would decide for you what had happened. The alert on my phone multiplied. What had been a single amber bubble became a series of messages stacked by priority. Monitoring service, internal incident queue, then, less expected, a terse formal notification from our compliance portal that read like a cold summons. I scrolled through with the same steady attention I gave a patient's chart. An event detected, custodial flag triggered, automated escalation initiated. The words were clinical, the consequences were not. Miriam called before I could decide where to start. Her voice was short, the kind of tone lawyers use when they are sorting facts and calming fear at the same time. "Eris," she said, "we're getting inquiries. Preserve everything. Don't delete anything. Copy the files. Where are you?" "Still in the auditorium," I said. I was honest because we were not playing to cameras. We were building a record. "Stay there if you need to," she said. "I'm on my way. I'll call the board. I'll call DCSA. You'll have federal eyes in minutes. Be prepared to hand over logs. And," there was a pause that scraped of its own gravity, "document every call." She was right. Within 20 minutes, a formal notice arrived in counsel's inbox. An automated alert had been routed, per our reporting agreements, to the Defense Counterintelligence and Security Agency. An NSA liaison pinged their counterparts. The FBI's corporate liaison opened a case file for potential custodial compromise. Those are not small words in our world. They are the language of regulatory gravity. Word traveled inside the company with the efficiency of rumor. The reception area buzzed. Marcus arrived at the sub-basement security desk with a printed notice from facility security. Effective immediately, active custodial operations were to cease pending review. Access lists were frozen. That meant badges that had worked for years went dark in the space of an hour. Staff who had keys to labs found the entryways polite but locked. The physical reality of the building changed before lunch. It felt oddly theatrical and devastating at once, like a stage suddenly stripped of its set. A compliance call came in that afternoon that read like a mediated emergency. Miriam and I on speaker, a stern voice from corporate security, a representative from a contracting client, and an auditor with a muted HVAC breath in the background. "We received notice of a custodial capture flag," the auditor said. "Given your contract clauses, we are suspending activities until we verify custodial integrity." In plain English, a major contract, one with a lifecycle value in the billions, was on hold. We were told, off the record and then on, that a $5 billion program had suspended its engagement pending forensic analysis. The company's stock did not collapse in one theatrical ticker tape moment. It began a steadier, harder slide as partners canceled calls and procurement conversations froze. Suppliers called to ask whether their invoices would be honored. The client's contracting officer requested an immediate audit and the withdrawal of any on-site personnel who were not expressly exempt. It was the kind of domino set that had been assembled over years of trust, and now waited in the wind. There were immediate personnel consequences, too. Access controls at the facility were tightened, and with those tightened controls came the sort of bureaucratic violence that always follows a compliance breach. Temporary suspensions for roles that manage custodial keys, mandatory interviews, and a freeze on any promotions tied to project velocity. Some teams were told to work from home while their physical credentials were reissued under supervision. Others were told to stand down entirely. At home that evening, there was a strange staccato loneliness to the situation. My phone vibrated between calls from colleagues, an unanswered text from a junior engineer I barely knew by name, and a message from a reporter who had spotted the ceremonial video online and wanted a comment. I did not answer the reporter. I replied to the engineer with procedural calm. Document your timeline. Don't speculate.
The journalist would get formal statements. The story itself was already seeding in the press as symbolic retirement gone wrong and nepotism costs $5 billion. Headlines that would make their way to op-ed columns and late-night panels. Rumor and headline are a special kind of erosion. They strip nuance from an event and make the scaffolding look shabby regardless of the engineer's actual diligence. The board convened within 48 hours. I received the calendar invite stamped emergency. The invitation was clinical and polite, the sort of document designed to communicate gravity without panic. In the room, I felt the simultaneous pressure of proximity and distance. Executives who had supported my work for a decade across the table, the CEO, Lawrence, whose face has always suggested both a kindness and an old caution, and Kieran, who sat in the corner with the inattentive smile of someone who still believed optics were the whole of governance. The first hour was a choreography of fact-gathering. Council presented the chain of events: the town hall, the ceremonial cut, the automated custodial capture flag, the internal logs that recorded administrative changes in the hours leading to the event. I watched faces as each element was read aloud, some relief when notarized memos were shown as proof of prior objection, some tight-lipped annoyance as details about unauthorized admin requests were displayed. Kieran's account was predictably theatrical. The cut was symbolic, he said. He gestured at the slide deck. He argued about momentum and modernization, as if the aesthetic truth of transformation could substitute for contractual reality. Lawrence listened and then, with a measure of paternal protectiveness, chastised his son for the bad optics. There was a moment when a father's instinct to shield a child rose up and nearly obscured the corporate need to take ownership of mistakes. The board's question was simpler than Kieran's talk. How do we reverse the harm? It was both a technical and a reputational question, and the two were entangled to the point of braided hazard. The CEO looked at me with something between an apology and a request. "Can you get us back to where we were?" he asked. I could, but at what cost? There was a ledger to balance. Time, money, lost contracts, regulatory trust. One of the realities of systems that interact with government programs is that a single custodial incident invites federal scrutiny that is not easily shook. The DCSA could require personnel vetting, audits of processes, and this was the hard part, time-consuming recertifications. The client could choose to rebid the work. Companies that supply defense programs live and die in schedules and certifications. There were no quick fixes. I offered to help, but not as an employee. I had been a company officer, and in that capacity, part of the structure that had been compromised. For both legal clarity and personal integrity, my role would need to be independent. I prepared a memorandum that afternoon, not as a theatrical flourish, but as a precise set of terms. An independent consultancy with a fixed, substantial retainer, indemnity against any legal exposure stemming from executive decisions I documented, public acknowledgement in internal and external communication of executive interference that contributed to custodial confusion, and the authority to assemble a recovery team that could operate with a direct reporting line to council and, when needed, the board. There was a pause when the terms were read aloud. I did not enumerate the numbers in the boardroom. I did, however, explain the shape of the retainer, enough to fund a small, specialized team and to ensure the company would be investing in a measured, not knee-jerk, recovery. The indemnity clause was non-negotiable. The work I proposed would put me in the middle of legal scrutiny. I would not undertake it without protection. The public attribution requirement felt like a moral calculus. If an executive act had materially contributed to the incident, that had to be acknowledged. The board deliberated. Kieran's defense of his gesture softened into defensive rationalizations. Lawrence looked pulled in directions that almost required physical splitting. Some directors wanted the quickest path to perception management. Release a statement, show renewed controls, move on. Others, older hands who had navigated audit cycles and federal ceilings, insisted on full transparency with the hiring client and the agencies. The vote was close, and the final compromise was, like many compromises, a layered thing. I would be engaged as a consultant. The company would accept financial exposure for the recovery. The role of the executives in the lead-up would be described in a way the board council agreed upon. My consultancy began the following week. The formal document preserved my demand that the board acknowledge, in an internal memo at least, the executive actions that preceded the event. Externally, the company had to be physically cautious about how much it revealed. Federal partners and auditors would conclude their own investigations. The public narrative would be shaped by press and procurement decisions. I signed the retainer. I am not comfortable recounting fee details as a matter of showmanship, but the arrangement was sufficient to fund a small operations cell capable of overnight fieldwork and contract logistics. Little of the recovery resembled cinematic heroics. There were no dramatic restore from backup sequences. There were crates, climate-controlled trucks, paper manifests, calls to a deep archive center in Utah that Draycross Logistics had managed for years. The cloud myth was cleared out of the way. Data redundancy for work of this sensitivity often had its knees in physicality. Tapes live in vaults.
Vaults are located where the earth is dry and the power is stable. The first real hope we had was a manifest that listed magnetic tape cartridges stored under the custody of a federal archive partner in a hardened facility outside Salt Lake City. I took a flight the next morning with 2 technicians and a curator who knew their way around an archive as intimately as a sommelier knows a vineyard. We met a man named Luis who managed shipments. He had gray at the temple and a patient look of someone who has seen industrious panic before. The crates were palletized and shrink-wrapped. They smelled faintly of desert and mineral oil. We signed chain of custody forms. I watched the curator stamp his initials, as if each stamp were a small prayer. You do not rush chain of custody. If you skip a step, what you retrieve becomes legally and operationally suspect. We loaded them onto a secure van with an escort and drove them to a staging area. It is exhausting work in the tactile sense. Heavy boxes, precise labels, inventory counts that have to be read twice. It is also emotionally fatiguing because each crate might be the difference between reconstructing a program and having to declare certain datasets irretrievable. For weeks, we worked under a routine that felt biblical in its repetition. Sign, seal, transport, ingest. The ingest itself was not the sort of technical instruction I will narrate here. What I can say is that the process was slow, complicated, and non-glamorous. The team worked in shifts. Coffee became ceremonial. Dinner plans dissolved. Newcomers learned the vocabulary of patience. Slot, tape library, mount. They learned to respect the physicality of their work. While one team physically moved media, another team, the legal and compliance group I helped coordinate, handled the communications. We had to balance transparency with contractual secrecy. We notified the agencies and clients about the recovery steps. We created an audited schedule of re-ingestion and validation. We worked to provide the client with confident updates without promising outcomes we could not guarantee. That kind of communication is a skill, to be truthful without surrendering hope or inflaming fear. The months that followed were a slow, grinding reclaiming of stability. It took 6 months, by the conservative estimate used in our recertification plan, to re-ingest and validate the datasets at a level the DCSA and our contracting client considered acceptable. There were nights when the team sat in labs under fluorescent lights that made coffee look like a sacrament and spreadsheets look like scripture. There were days when the printer jammed and the small human frustration stacked like a barometer of fatigue. There were layoffs and reorganizations too. Some roles were redundant in the new architecture the board approved, and the company had to make hard cuts to preserve more critical capabilities.
Those are always the quiet moral costs of corporate failure. People lose jobs even when the corporate entity survives. I felt each of those losses like a personal debt. I did what I could to place people in contact with recruiters and federal programs and to provide references. It was not enough compensation for what they had to endure, but it was the sort of practical ballast that decent leaders provide when systems wobble. In the end, the facility was recertified. The client decided, after a lengthy and public procurement process, to award their next phase to a consortium that included Ashford Dynamics, but with materially different terms. The $5 billion figure became, in public, a shorthand for what was lost, but the actual contract awards and timelines were restructured in ways that favored stability and risk aversion. The company survived, but it was not the same company it had been. It shrank in some lines of business, expanded in others, and operated under a new culture that valued a little more caution and a little less spectacle. Kieran's role changed. The board, in a private motion,
removed him from direct oversight of programs touching controlled access. He was assigned to a consumer-facing division, a move that protected the company from headlines while also acknowledging that familial ties create complicated governance problems. There were legal inquiries into the event. Some inquiries closed without finding criminal intent. Others recommended further administrative action. I will not speculate about criminality. What I will say is this: the consequence of his public, symbolic act was real and expensive and changed many people's careers. The public credit of an act and the private chain of custody are not the same thing, and governance that confuses the two will pay for it. As for me, there were offers. Not long after the recovery began to stabilize, an agency I had worked with in an advisory posture reached out with an invitation I had never expected, a senior role that would put me closer to the systems at the federal level and farther from the capriciousness of corporate optics. It was an attractive option: meaningful work, stable procedure, and the chance to influence policy that could prevent other organizations from repeating our mistakes. I did not accept immediately. Part of me wanted to see the recovery fully respectful to the people who had given nights in fluorescent light, and to watch as the company learned. Part of me also wanted to be outside the conflict zones of family-run boards. I chose, in the end, a neither-nor that became a both-and. I continued as a consultant long enough to complete the recertification and to ensure people were rehired or transitioned responsibly. Then, when the recovery had a firm footing, I accepted the agency's offer. It was a quiet transfer, an exit that felt procedural rather than dramatic.
I left Ashford Dynamics with the simple satisfaction that the record of my actions, the notarized memos, the log entries, the sealed envelopes, stood as a clear line of truth against the more performative narrative. My departure was not an abandonment, but a reallocation of where I thought my work would be most useful. There are small vindications that do not sound like vindication in headlines. Years later, a partnering contractor executive who had been skeptical during the earliest days of the incident wrote me an email thanking me for the rigor of our documentation. "You kept your discipline," she wrote. "That mattered." Praise like that does not erase the cost. It does, however, confirm the thesis I have carried for my career. Competence is quiet, and it is cumulative. I teach, sometimes, small seminars now for programs that combine government and private sector security thinking. One of my standard exercises is simple: place a small weighted object in the center of a tabletop and ask a room full of ambitious managers what you should do with it. They want to design grand plans. I ask them instead to map the simplest, legally and physically sound custodial chain. Who signs for it? Who witnesses? Where does it live? The point is not to deny innovation. The point is to remind people that the choreography of small actions, paper, notarized memos, timestamps, is often what preserves the possibility of larger projects. If there is a single image from the incident that remains with me, it is not Kieran's smile with the scissors. It is Miriam's hand on my printed log, the brief human gesture of recognition that what we had done would matter later. It is Marcus at his desk, watching the door with the same old patience he always had. It is Lewis in Utah, taking a crate receipt as if his stamp were a small miracle. We like stories of dramatic sabotage and cinematic recovery. They make good television. The truth is less tidy and more human. Governance is a practice of small, consistent acts. Skilled people make careers out of preparing for the thing that others imagine will never happen. The cost of ignoring them is not always visible in real time. Sometimes it arrives as a quiet failure to meet a contractual milestone. Sometimes it appears as a lost program or a staff reduction. Sometimes it is a public lesson hammered out in audits and procurement cycles. Kieran's scissors were a symbolic act. The system treated them as operational reality. The difference between symbolism and operation is where governance either bends toward prudence or toward spectacle. That is the lesson I would offer now to anyone who runs systems that matter. Respect the friction. Respect the people who insist on it. Remember that what looks like a trinket to one ear is often in practice a key to someone else's livelihood.
If this story connected with you, if you've seen performative solutions displace careful engineering, or if you've watched a leader prefer optics to operational integrity, share where you are watching from in the comments, and share this with someone who needs to hear that patience and discipline are not obstacles to progress, but the scaffolding that makes progress sustainable. We are not moralizing about innovation. We are reminding ourselves that competence, in the long run, is the kind of thing that outlasts a speech, a slide deck, or a sharp photograph. It is quiet, it is exacting, it is often inconveniently the thing that prevents a collapse. If you found something in this account that matters, if it made you pause, or if it confirmed something you felt, share it with someone who needs to hear that steady work still matters.